Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, audience, wherever you are. Welcome to this first episode of Nautilus podcast. Today we have with us our special guest coming from us, in fact, from the other side of the world, but from many parts of the world as well. I would say one of the most famous writers that should be known in America and throughout the West, but unfortunately isn't. We'll do our best here to a little bit repair that state. Mr. Lindin, welcome to this podcast and thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I look forward to this conversation. Can't wait.
Well, what I will do is give a few excerpts from your own writings. So to introduce you in your own words without you having to do that. Just give me a moment. So a quotation which I would like to add for the benefit of our audience. It is first of all something from the Nautilus title that I myself use for this podcast. A quotation from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which I think is quite applicable to this podcast. I am not what you call a civilized man. I have done with society entirely for reasons which I alone have the right of appreciating. I do not therefore obey its laws, and I desire you never to allude to them before me again. This is the first quote. The second, of course, is from Lindin himself, from an interview with, I found it online from Neonpajamas, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And here our guest says the following. Language is mostly used to disguise and mislead, with whatever importance hardly ever being addressed, much less probed. Although failing abjectly, of course, I've tried to shape these unmentionables. I suggested that after the reading, that the first poem hasn't been written, that poets are merely preparing the groundwork for a distant poetry of the future. Which of necessity must be unspeakably devastating. We are now still in the prehistory of poetry. And the second quote from the same interview. In the US, nearly all self-identified rebels only rebel in pre-described and heavily manipulated ways, which makes them pawns of the very people that they think they are rebelling against. History will retch in disgust at the cowardly collusion of our intellectuals. So far, the citations that I found. That being said, let me introduce you to our guests with a very specific question. Your name is Lindin. How is it pronounced correctly? And what does it refer to in your own language? Does it have a meaning?
Well, in Vietnamese, it's the other way around. So, and it has a middle name, so it's Dinh Hoang Linh. But when I came to the States, it was flipped to, the middle name was deleted. And interestingly, because Linh Dinh sounds like adrift in Vietnamese, because the Vietnamese word for adrift is Linh Dinh. So in a way, my destiny was shaped by my moving to the United States, because I've been drifting ever since then, despite myself. I keep talking about being grounded, but, I've been all over the damn place, and I can't say I'm unhappy about it. But I know what you mean. You constantly stressed by reclaiming, your own heritage, your own ancestry, and your own blood. So, and I agree with you totally. But the fact that we're talking in English in itself is already, we are bastards. Well, of course we have to talk in English. What choice do we have? But my stronger language is actually English and not Vietnamese. So. I publish in Vietnamese quite a bit, but, I'm most comfortable in English because I grew up as an adult. I grew up in the United States. But on the other hand, I'm not an American totally, because I got there when I was 11, so there's so many contradictions. I'm sure. Are you talking to me from Budapest and not your homeland?
Well, at the moment, I'm actually in my homeland, but I do agree that's quite a rare exception to the rule, which is being uprooted, perhaps not to the degree that you are. Let me ask you a question. I'm not sure about your Wikipedia site. Still, many people, if they want to know something about somebody, refer to Wikipedia, which is not entirely a correct procedure, but still. If I read correctly, you are born 1963. And in fact, you were taken out of your home country, Vietnam, at that very famous 1975 moment, the Saigon moment. Is that correct?
Yes. I left just literally maybe 7 hours before the airport was shelled. So I'm on the last to leave, and I left on a C-130 plane. It was a military plane, and I had no idea where I was going. I mean, we were evacuated, and my father used a fake paper to get me on that plane to begin with. So I left without my father, with my little brother, with $2,000 sewn into my shorts. That was my money. So, and I didn't take off that pair of shorts for weeks because I couldn't afford to lose it. So, but I ended up in Guam, and I had never heard of Guam before I landed in Guam. So, yeah, so I left right. Like I'm talking to you now in a room, in a colonial room. I'm renting this space very cheap actually, but it was built by the French in 1901. So, and it's a very comfortable room. I'm glad the French built some great architecture in Vietnam. Unfortunately, many of these buildings have been destroyed, by the communists because they thought, well, this is a colonial legacy. But the best looking buildings in my city, Vũng Tàu, were actually built by the French, and hey, there's no reason to get rid of them.
Well, of course, the Europeans have this very romantic notion about Vietnam. They are seeing movies, they are reading books, and they have this impression of this beautiful Paris of the Orient, which used to be Ho Chi Minh City, in the past Saigon. And I do think it is important for our audience to understand where you're coming from. Vietnam and Vietnamese is a very old culture. The language of Vietnamese, of course, is also a very ancient culture, written as long as most European languages are. You are a writer in Vietnamese, and I would like to ask you, because also I'm a writer and a linguist, and I'm interested in your language, although I know hardly anything about it. Can you say something about the heresy of the colonial era? Because in that colonial era, your language started to be written in an entirely different script, doing away with the logographic script that you used to have over there. I imagine that must have affected culture, literature, and even perception to a very deep extent, to have your writing system changed and your language system changed to that degree so deeply. If I read correctly, the writing system, it was called something like Chunom. I will not pronounce it correctly, I guess. And it used to be something like a Sino-Vietnamese thinking, expression, and language system. Can you say something about how that has impacted the way Vietnamese language allows you to express yourself? Is there any impact? The legacy of the colonial era.
Okay. Well, before Vietnam was colonized by China for roughly 1,000 years, it had no written language. The bronze drums are claimed by the Vietnamese as the ancestral legacy. These are the ancient bronze drums that date back to 2,600 years ago. But on these bronze drums, there's no writing. Okay, so the Chinese brought writing to Vietnam, and the educated Vietnamese wrote in Chinese, so they already were using a foreign script. Okay, I mean they had their own language, but the educated used Chinese to read, to write. They wrote poems in Chinese, so already they were using a foreign language to express themselves. But that's not too unlike the educated European using Latin. So it's not too unusual. But the Vietnamese script, the alphabets that is being used now, was actually devised by a Portuguese priest, Alexander the Road, which is it wasn't the French didn't. He made it. He came up with this script as a phonetic transcription to teach other missionaries here how to learn Vietnamese. He devised a Portuguese, Latin, and Vietnamese dictionary to help other priests learn Vietnamese so they can preach. They could preach, and he was actually a Jew. So there you go. I keep going about Jews, but he was a Jew, a converted Jew, okay, because he was a Catholic priest. And so the Vietnamese owe him a lot, for this script because it made learning so much easier. Before that, only a small percentage could read at all. So with the alphabet, almost all Vietnamese can read now. So during the Vietnam War, both the North and the South agreed that, well, actually the adoption of this script preceded the division of North and South, during the Vietnam War. But both sides use this, common script to make the population more, literate. But I know that you had a strong emphasis on the corruption of language, how language has been degraded, and it's interesting that when I was a child in Vietnam, there were many Americans and Australians and all kinds of foreigners and Koreans too in Vietnam because of the war. There was just a huge presence of foreigners there, but English was not that prevalent. Okay, it's actually more prevalent now, which I find bizarre, and a lot of it is because of the internet. Okay, and because America is even sexier now in the United States, in Vietnam, which I find almost pathetic. So, but I think this is a global phenomenon. America, as it goes down, is still seductive. It's still very sexy. So, in my city, which is a secondary city in Vietnam, I see signs in English everywhere, and often it's bad English, And I see the kids, even the first grader, greeting each other by hello, and they say sorry instead of sorry in Vietnamese. I find that very problematic. Okay, because you know what? Because they're looking at their phones all day long. They fixated on their phones. So they bombarded with English because they have to learn some English to use the internet, So the erosion of Vietnamese is actually accelerating now because of the virtual culture that the whole world has to deal with. So that is something to resist, So, concurrent with this seduction of English is a fascination with everything American, okay, including Trump, believe it or not. I've seen sort of versions of MAGA hats here. I mean, not many, but just a few. I saw one that was obviously not was probably made in China because it say "Make Americans," not America, "Make Americans Great Again." Because obviously a misreading of that term. So, and I keep complaining about this, but the more I complain about this here, the more I annoy people because they don't see anything wrong with it. They all trying to learn English, especially the children. Okay, so as I stress on the degradation of the Vietnamese language because as they focus so much on English, the Vietnamese is suffering. The spoken Vietnamese and the written Vietnamese. I see weird misspellings on signs even. I mean, just bizarre misspellings. It's slipping. And, I think you yourself have pointed out how because everybody's texting, they're using shorthands, they're using abbreviations. Language is really falling apart, man, because, because they're typing very sloppily and they're losing their focus because no one is focusing because, the attention span is so poor. So all these factors are combining to destroy native language, native culture, and a sense of place. People hardly know what they are. If you ask them what the color of the wall of the very room they're sitting in, they don't know. They don't even know. You might ask them what's the color of your bedroom. They might not even know because they never look at it.
Well, you're referring, of course, to the bubble space in which many people are living, the social media space, which is deforming people, which has an effect on people, which is partially technology driven, but it's, I think, also driven in other ways. And here we come to a very important point, and that is language. Language warfare, cognitive warfare, which is a part of this. The resistance against simplification, for example, is a part of warfare. And I think there's this saying that if you cannot say what you mean, you cannot mean what you say. So, and here, of course, we are intruding on your terrain, your vocation, writing. You do that in English and you do it in Vietnamese. I've, of course, only read some of your work in English, poetry as well as postcards, book. And I think my general impression, but people that will have to judge for themselves, is that you do have this ability to point out a very important fact: the deconstruction of language and the deconstruction of of experience and how they relate to each other. In a similar way, I think like how Celine did things and how Henry Miller did things. They were able by using quite strong language in an unusual way to shed light on this problem of deconstruction of language. But people will have to judge that for themselves. I just like to interest them in it. And here we come to the main topic of the theme of our podcast today, which is um, let's say Homo Aeroporticus, like I called it in my article. But that, of course, implies a lot more than that. So, more than man in the condition of being a nomad, being a wanderer in his world. And just to give a first thought that I find important in this regard is, I didn't point it out in my article, but is the traditional opposition, the traditionalist opposition between the sacred wanderer, the traditional wanderer, and the modern wanderer, which relate to each other. For example, something like the wandering dervish of tradition towards the wandering salesman, and may I say, the wandering Jew of today. It's a condition, the modern condition of wandering, of not being rooted, of not having a reference system, is something entirely different than the person that decides for a certain specific purpose, spiritual or otherwise, to distance himself from roots. And I find this a very important thing to point out to people because we are facing this uprootedness and this Homo Aeroporticus status in all walks of life. Of course, it is now summer season in Europe. You have the mass tourism, which is actually something like I would call an inverted pilgrimage. So you are not going to learn, you're not going to grow, you're not going to get better by your experience as a tourist, but you are going to change the destination. Not the traveler is changed, but the destination is changed, or maybe in the end nothing is changed. Now, of course, you said it yourself before the podcast. If there is one person who has experienced very closely the status of Homo Aeroporticus, it's you. You have traveled around the world probably more than most people, anybody will know, which has its ad and disadvantages. And I would like to have your take on that phenomenon, like I call it Homo Aeroporticus, the state of being, yeah, let's say the wandering Jew. Cain, in a certain sense, the biblical Cain. What is that experience like? Where does it come, and where is it going again?
Well, let's also talk about being a refugee because there are so many refugees now, not just war refugees but economic refugees. So, and I think you brought up the introduction of very cheap flights. Flying used to be much more civilized, but now it's really barbaric. Because just the check-in and just the security screening, just the absurdity of having to throw away your water bottle. I mean, just everything about it. It's like you being subjected to this humiliation just before you could get on a plane to begin with, and because everybody's looking for the cheapest flights, and I do the same because you look for flights online. You choose the cheapest fares to anywhere, so you end up in these absurd packed planes with people who maybe shouldn't be on planes, and maybe I shouldn't be on planes either. But flying now is something to endure. Okay, but most people do not travel well. Okay, most people do not like to travel because when they travel, they get very alarmed, and they want to prove that they've been somewhere. That's it. So they go somewhere to take a photo. And many people just take cruises. Okay, so they just want to be on land for as little time as possible, so they can get back on the boat with the same people, with the same their compatriots, and eat the same food. And but they want to prove that they've been somewhere. So traveling is a very interesting phenomenon now because people have an opportunity to go many places very cheaply, but deep down they literally dread it. And I've seen this happen over and over again, even with people I travel with. That's why I do not travel with anyone anymore, because if I travel with anyone, inevitably there are arguments. So people lose their composure because they really hate to be among alien people in alien places. It really scares them. So, but anyway, but you have the refugees. People are also forced out of their homelands. I was just in Jordan, a country of refugees. Okay, there is a misconception that the wars that are being caused by the West force people to flee to the West, but most of them flee to neighboring countries first. Okay, so in Jordan, there's all these Palestinians, Syrians, Yemenis, Iraqis, all these Arabs that are not from that area. So Jordan, I don't know, maybe at least 2/3 refugees, but now they have nowhere else to go. So, you know, and you know, I start out as a refugee, but I spent 5 months teaching in Leipzig, and I thought that was interesting because I'd never been among people who hate themselves so much. So these were Germans who didn't want to be Germans. I mean, they literally did not want to be German. I mean, I didn't know the term Volksstaat, right? Is that the term, the death to the folks? I mean, I never know what they would have that on the walls of graffitis. So in a sense, they are displaced too, although they are in Germany. Okay, the Germans are displaced, although they haven't gone. I had a friend there, Oliver, who was a local friend, and we would walk around Leipzig all over the place, but I never saw him greet anyone or talk to anyone. You know, if you visit me in Vũng Tàu, we can't walk 2 blocks or 1 block without me waving at people or introducing to people. So, but Oliver, we walked miles, man, and he didn't know anyone. You know, I said, well, how is that possible? He's a German living in a German city, and he didn't know anyone. And whenever we enter a bar, he was more nervous than me. You know, seriously. I would stop babbling away. I would get drunk and start talking. He was more tense than me. So I realized, wait a second. This guy is more alienated in his homeland than I was. And I don't think that's too unusual, you know. But maybe in Germany, it's more pronounced. Because I really, among my students too, you know, I can sense that some of them just hated to be German. You know, they would rather be anything else. Oh, they would rather be just global or Europeans or whatever. So I said, wait a second, that's a serious problem, you know, this self-hatred. And where did it come from? You know, because of this imposed guilt enforced on them by the Jews. Okay, I'm going to say it, all right? But this self-hatred is also more pervasive everywhere because people just feel inferior, okay? The Vietnamese feel inferior. They feel inferior to Americans. They feel inferior to the West. They are seduced by the West, and most of them have no chance of getting there, okay? But they think the West must be fantastic, must be so filthily rich, must be much more civilized, must be cleaner. You know, I hear the most bizarre observation from Vietnamese here, you know, because they once they know that I've been to the West, they can't understand any complaints or any criticism I have of it because they think, well, you know, it's like I'm walking out of the whorehouse and they never had sex, and I'm like, oh man, it's really terrible in there. They don't understand it, you know. It's like you enjoy all that and you're going back to complain. So basically, I've stopped talking like that. Okay, I keep it to myself. But I would say something that, you know, Vietnam and many other countries that I've been to that are supposedly third world or, you know, inferior are actually more civilized and by far safer than the United States. And there's less degradation on the streets. Okay. You go to any American city, any American downtown, you see homeless people everywhere. And you don't see that here in Vietnam. And even people who are not homeless are so isolated and so alone. Because in the United States, you pretty much just sit home and watch TV and watch pornography and listen to music. You know, you don't really know your neighbors. Here you see people talking and laughing. I live half a block from a park. They're dancing right now because they exercise together. You know, of course they can just stay home and dance by themselves to exercise, but these women are dancing right now, and the men are playing chess right now. They're always together. So that sense of community used to be, you know, basic. You know, it's a requirement. It's a necessity. But now it's being absent from so many lives. And I think the more advanced a society is, the more alienated people are. Okay, so the supposedly more primitive societies like Vietnam, you know, more backward societies are actually healthier. I'm not trying to glamorize like poverty or any of that, but you know, people need to talk to each other and laugh, and you know, but in Vietnam, that sociability is being eroded also, because nowadays when I go to the cafes, too many people look at cell phones. So, you know, they are heading towards what everybody else is already being subjected to. They're just slower to getting there. Okay. But basically, getting back to what you were saying, you know, everybody's alienated, even if they haven't gone anywhere, even if they haven't traveled, they're already alienated. So yeah, it is a serious problem because Vietnam is being taken away from them even as they live in Vietnam.
Well, in my article, I pointed out the example of Iranian exiles. So Iranians, famously, they went in millions abroad, not only after the Islamic Revolution, but also in recent years. These people who are abroad, they tend to be the ultimate example, or one of the ultimate examples of what you said, self-hatred. So, like the Germans hate themselves, they hate everything about their own country, about their own tradition, about their own religion, and they shift to the complete other side, the other extreme. Of course, it's called garbzedegi in their own language, like West toxification, you might call it, um, like a drug. People, they are like under the influence, we may say, of this West toxification. And not only do they reject their own heritage, they are violently opposed to their own country in many ways, even to the point of them cheering on while the Zionists, they bomb their country, for example. And it goes quite far, and um, it goes to directions that are almost counterintuitive. And I think this is another example of what you're talking about. So the alienation process, that is approximately equivalent to the degree to which you are modernized or which you are not modernized. What I've also noticed is that there is a, I would call it almost cultic aspect to it, like a satanic aspect. The way that you wish to oppose your homeland, your rootedness, automatically for most people means to reject any kind of spiritual grounding, any kind of spiritual seeking. So the opposite direction, of course, points you to what in the Bible is called the Mark of Cain. Yeah, so that's the prototypical wandering Jew, which is now something like an ideal state that people seek, even in their daily lives. Like traveling becomes a mania, not being rooted, moving around a lot is something that most people aspire to. Like you said, people, they wish to show themselves in various places and to take as many so-called holidays as possible, outings as possible. So this is a very extreme phenomenon. Of course, it has a technological aspect. I pointed that out. So the three A's, I call them, the automobile, the airplane, and the air conditioning, they enable, of course, this state. But I think this facilitates. These are facilitating elements, and it's not purely technology driven. It seems to have an autonomous process. This alienation drive. But I do believe it has also a certain amount of steering. It has a certain amount of direction. It's being taken advantage of. It's profitable for certain people, and it's being promoted especially in academia, the Western media. It is an ideal form of uprootedness, hating your own country and trying to remove yourself from tradition. And this is also something I would like to ask you about, because you have been highly critical of, let's say, the American establishment, its policies, not only international, but also internally. And you have pointed out, I think, as one of the very few people, the very important role of the COVID experiment in this regard, as a reset mechanism, and the vaccination um, that followed on this. And I'd like to ask you something about that. You have written extensively about the COVID and vaccination years. Now we are a little bit looking back at it. People's attention has shifted to other things. What do you think as a conclusion to these COVID years? What do you think are the long-term effects of the COVID experience and the vaccination drive? I call it the vaccinocaust, but in any case, I will let you speak about that.
I mean, just the term social distancing is almost comic because, in a sense, they've been imposing social distancing on us before COVID. Like you say, the air conditioning. We are socially isolated because in the United States they used to have these porches, right? So you can sit outside and greet your neighbors. But with the air conditioning, people move inside, and there's no reason to have porches. Um, you know. So even the architecture changed because of the air conditioning. you don't need to look outward. You can just lock yourself inside. And because you have to lock yourself inside to keep the cool air in, right? So the nicer cafes in this city, Vũng Tàu, for example, are air conditioned and with glass windows. Plate glass windows is also an interesting invention because it allows you to look outside, but it doesn't allow anyone to come in. So there's a wall, right? And in Vietnam, the cheaper cafes, the people who, the lottery sellers would walk right in, okay, to sell you lottery tickets or whatever, the people peddling fruits or whatever, so there's no barriers, okay? Most Vietnamese cafes, the cheaper one, look outward, okay? Now, I think the Westerners are more familiar with the Irish pub, the English pub, it's isolated, it's cozy, okay? There might even be a fireplace, right? So in the United States, you have like a horseshoe bar, right? So everyone is just looking at the people across the way, You sit at the bar by yourself, you're on a stool, your feet are off the ground, you're already not grounded, okay? You're sitting on a stool and you're looking across the way because you need social distancing. You need a distance, you need to see people, but you don't want them to be too close to you, or no one wants to be too close. So you're sitting and you're looking across the bar, a horseshoe bar, and the bartender is in the middle. Okay. So, but in Vietnam, people sit and look at the street, and everything is open. Anyone can walk in at any time, So the orientation is towards the street life, pedestrians, cars, and they can sit there for hours and just look at things moving, okay? But because that's the weather. It's hot here, you need to do that. But I'm bringing up the Irish pub, English pub is because it's drizzly in the UK, it's drizzly in Northern Europe. So you need to sit inside. But even the Irish pub and the English pub is a social space, a true English pub, dogs can walk in, children can walk in, but not in America. You cannot have children. Well, most bars do not want children inside the bar. So anyway, so you move from the English pub to like a very loud bar, the jukebox, right? The music is constantly on, the television is constantly on. So everybody's isolated. Even when you're among people, even when you're drinking, you're not talking to anybody because you can't, because it's too loud. And I tried to, because when I was in the States, that's all I did when I had any time was to go into a bar because I like to drink, I like to talk to people. But it was very difficult, okay? So everything conspired to keep you locked in. And that became the norm, man. People just think, well, this is how you're supposed to sit in a bar. You're supposed to sit there for 2 hours and not talk to anybody and just drink your beer and drink your whiskey and go home, okay? I mean, people do talk, but they cannot talk, they cannot talk, they have to shout at each other. They have to talk in little snippets, right? Because it's too loud, okay? So conversation became almost meaningless, okay? So all these inventions that are supposed to make us more comfortable and more entertained have conspired to isolate us, okay? The air conditioning, the television, and now the internet, okay? Now you sit in a bar and look at your cell phone, okay? So, we old enough to remember the boombox, right? Guys who walk around carry a huge boombox, and that, he's like an eccentric because most of you did not do that. And then they had the Walkman, so you didn't need a boombox. So now you can just be, you're on the street, but you're not really anywhere, okay? But now, now everybody's walking around looking at their cell phone or they listen to their own music. And I think one of the most important decisions I ever made in my life was when I was very young, I decided to stop listening to recorded music. Now, I haven't been able to do that totally, because every now and then, and also I want to know what's going on. So every now and then I check to see what's going on. And I used to love jazz, man. Before I was 20, I used to love to go to jazz concerts, and I used to educate myself about jazz because I used to love it. And then when I was really maybe 21, I said no more because I realized, wait a second, I've heard this number 50 times already. Do I need to hear it? No, I do not. I don't want to hear Thelonious Monk anymore. Okay, I've heard everything already. Okay, so anyway, I stopped listening to recorded music, and it's free up my mind. Okay, so another problem with being isolated is that you cannot think. You don't know what you're thinking. You cannot have ideas or complex ideas, and you forget everything because everything cancels. It's always the next thing you're looking forward to. So I want to say something about poetry too, because no one read poems anymore. That's the last thing they want to read, because poetry is slow reading. You have to be very attentive, and you have, but most poets are, there's always been bad poets, or maybe I'm one too. I'm not claiming that, I'm anything exceptional, but it's difficult to write a poem, obviously. And, but a true poet, every word is chosen very carefully. Okay. So the reader should have the same attention, should have the same care at reading a poem as a poet had in writing the poem. Okay. But no one has that attention span anymore. No one has that focus to read that carefully. Okay. So not only can't they read poems, they can't read anything. They skim. Okay. So that's another example of the corruption of language. So, we cannot hear each other carefully. We cannot read anything. We cannot read a book. We cannot read 1,000 words. So that's why there's no insight. There's no conversation. That's why, it's interesting, because Trump is all about slogans. He has slogans. So he seduced them with the most idiotic slogans. The big, beautiful bill is like just one term, right? Just meaningless, right? Everything is like big as, whatever, right? Just even make America great again. It's what does that mean? I mean, he hasn't made anything great again, but it's on his, he wears that hat. So what I'm trying to get is that dumb people need slogans, need snippets, need sound bites. That's all they can tolerate. And it's tragic that, that an obvious con man like Donald Trump can seduce so many people with a series of slogans and, and meaningless phrases. So, to shift the focus a bit, Vietnam is a totalitarian state. So there are also slogans, okay? But, the Vietnamese communists are not really communists anymore. See, now maybe we can bring up the issue of globalism, global movements, global trends, global ideology. Communism is supposed to be a global ideology. And, I would say it's very much about founded on a kind of Jewish mindset, okay? Us against them, group guilt, okay? If you're a bourgeoisie, you're guilty. If you're this, you're guilty. If you're a proletariat, you're heroic. It's nonsense, okay? The Christian concept is that you're guilty because you're guilty individually. You can go guilty the next second. It's a moment by moment. You guide your own moral journey, okay? So you can lapse at any second, But the Jewish mindset is that group is guilty and that group is not guilty. Okay, that group is they are terrorists. We should kill them all. So communism came out of that mindset. But the Vietnamese communists have rebranded themselves, because that doesn't work here. Okay, so now they are basically nationalists. They stress nationalism. They stress love of Vietnam. They rebranded. They frame Ho Chi Minh as a nationalist. So they bring up all his quotations about love of the people, but the Vietnamese people. It doesn't mean the Cambodians or the Chinese. It doesn't mean anybody. It just means the people. Okay, so that's the legitimacy here. They can only appeal to the Vietnamese people by pretending that they have always been nationalists. Okay. So, but even when they were fighting the Americans, and even when during the war, many of them were actually nationalists, but they had this sort of overlay of Marxism and internationalism. But all of that has disappeared. You'll be very hard pressed to find a picture of Marx on any propaganda billboard here. Every now and then you see one, but Marx has pretty much disappeared. Lenin has disappeared. It's all about Ho as a great kind of father figure. Vietnamese father figure who loves Vietnam. Okay, there's almost nothing about internationalism anymore. So, so that's another twist, because basically that's the only thing that can sustain people over time is love of nation, love of land, love of language, your specific language. Okay, and we have different languages because I don't want you to hear, what my people think or know. I want to keep you out of it. Every language is like a secret code, man. And I have no access to your culture. Okay, which is fine. When I go somewhere and I don't understand anything, hey, I'm not supposed to understand anything. I didn't understand the Arabs that when I was in Jordan, so what? I was just grateful that they accepted me as a guest, and I was a guest, of course, nothing more than that, which is fine. Okay, so we have these different languages because we are different families. Simple as that, And by pretending that we can learn English and graduate to English, is an illusion. It's funny. A few years ago, I was in Singapore for a literary festival. Okay, I must say, I mean, this is sound a little ungrateful, but I must say the Singaporean poetry I heard was not very impressive because it was in English. I'm not saying there might be one day a Singaporean writer of English who is exceptional, but I realized something a little false about all this. I mean, I heard a bunch of them, and I thought, wait a second, they're not really writing. They're not using their mother tongue. They're not using the words that move them the most. Okay, of course, in day-to-day conversation, they also use English. Okay, but if they ethnic Chinese, why not write in Chinese? Why are they writing in English? And it's not even like that quirky Singlish, Singaporean English that might be interesting. They were trying to write, more correct English, and I thought, well, this is dreadful, man. No one wants to hear that, and no one wants to read that either. So anyway, you have to use the language that your mother taught you, okay, that you used when you were a child, okay. You have to tap into that. The deepest source, the deepest well of your being is what will feed you, not as a writer, as a person. So I think that's being neglected seriously right now, and I'm sure you agree.
What I think interesting about what you just said is the degree to which certain idioms, certain language forms are hidden, they are private, they are code languages in a certain sense that keep others out. They serve to preserve exclusiveness in a certain way. Of course, one of the ultimate examples of that is Biblical Hebrew, which I had to study in my course of Semitic languages. It's a code in many respects, and there are many secondary codes. For example, Aramaic of the Kabbalah, which is a code within a code. And there are many of such code systems, and what I see is a polarization. So on the one hand, you get this tiny elite that controls world affairs, that has access to these codes, directly or indirectly, and the great mass that's being degraded by speaking languages that is not their own, and that is being degraded all the time into slogans and into snippets, like you said. I think this is a very interesting polarization process which is taking place, and which probably is very useful for people on top, because, of course, anomie and atomization is very useful for commercial purposes, control purposes, manipulation purposes. And you just pointed out the need to preserve these private languages that all of us possess from our birth, to treasure them and to keep them secret to a certain extent, not only try to teach people languages because they come into our countries. I think this is a very valid and very good point, but something about this very exclusive club that is ruling world affairs, because there is such a club. I call it the globalist elite, to be just as a shorthand, but the identity thereof is quite wrapped into a riddle and into a mystery for many people. Of course, here we're talking about the relation between this group and tradition. So this elite claims for itself a status of a protected people, a special people, a chosen people, on the basis of, let's say, old text, mythology, religious traditions, twisted, of course. And you always are very straightforward in naming the beast. You just call it by its old-fashioned name, which is the Jew. You also mentioned the Jew jab as it's a characterization of what happened in the COVID time. And I think in this sense, you are trying to be very blunt, also very effective. And I think you're falling here in this category of Ezra Pound, who did the same. Ezra Pound he was also a poet. He also was American, and he tried to be as direct as possible in his language to make people think in different ways. You have been writing now for a long time. You have been writing something like a travel blog, we might say, collecting impressions and sharing them with people. What is the overall trajectory of your own work? If you look back on all these years that you have been working, to what degree do you think you have been successful uh, in what the task that you set yourself in the way you have set out in your literary journey? How do you evaluate it to this point?
Well, I think 9/11 was a huge turning point for me because that really radicalized me because it took me a while to figure out something uh, was not correct, as far as the official stories. I used to live right outside Washington D.C. in Northern Virginia, so I passed the Pentagon all the time. I also work in Washington for a little while, for almost a year. So anyway, I'm very familiar with Washington D.C., that whole region. So the Pentagon is not all that high, okay. And for airliner to hit it from the side just made no sense to me. Made no sense, okay. Just common sense. You don't have to be, you don't have to be a pilot or to figure that out. I mean, from the sky, if you want to hit a target like that, you hit it from an angle. Just common sense, right? So for them to claim that I hit it from the side just make no sense. So anyway, the official story has so many holes, and most people don't even know, even to this day, there was a building 7. So anyway, I was right outside DC when 9/11 happened, and when I was a teenager, I even went out on top of the World Trade Center, So I mean, um, New York and Washington were not that unfamiliar to me. I mean, Washington specifically was very familiar to me. So then when I realized, wait a second, they really lying and they're getting away with it, and that was really surprising because as I talk about this, most people just brush me off. But I did an interview with Rudy Dent, a fireman, a New York City fireman. He was a veteran, he was a Vietnam War vet, and he went back to become a policeman or something. But basically, he was a fireman for many years. He would give testimonies at court. He was a very seasoned fireman. So he was right outside Building 7 when it collapsed. Okay, so I did an interview with him in Detroit in a car. Okay, so he basically explained that it just makes no sense. But anyway, I mean, I already knew that before I talked to Rudy Dent. But if the United States still had a free press, that interview should be published by somebody, right? I mean, forget New York Times, forget Washington Post, maybe the Boise, Idaho, something, right? Or the Walla Walla newspaper. There must be thousands of newspapers there. Somebody should be interested in a veteran fireman who was right outside Building 7, who very patiently tried to explain to you what didn't make sense, right? But no one touched Rudy Dent. No one touched that interview. And, the media in the United States is completely controlled. I'll give you another example. Most people already know Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize winner at the New York Times. Okay. I mean, he wasn't just, most war correspondents, they go to a city, they sit in the hotel, and they just write from the hotel. They don't want to be with the troops, man, and that's what happened in Vietnam, man. They sit, right in downtown Saigon, and they get their whores, they get their prostitutes, they get their alcohol, and then they write reports, right? But Chris Hedges was with the soldiers, and he was captured by the Iraqis. So he has some, courage. You got to give him that, right? So he was a real journalist, right? He's a top-notch journalist and an excellent writer. Okay, so what happened was he saw the first invasion of Iraq, the first war against Iraq, and then he started to speak about it later on, and then the New York Times pretty much let him go. Now, a Pulitzer winner, one of America's top public intellectuals, you would think somebody else would hire him, right? No one would hire him. Okay, so that's another interesting case, right? So he ended up at Russia Today. Only Russia Today would pay him to do anything. Okay, and my last interview in the United States was with Chris Hedges. Okay, and I'm bringing this up because Chris Hedges had nothing to gain from me. by interviewing me because I'm like a zero, but he's a figure. But the fact that he interviewed me meant he took some risk because he knew what I thought about 9/11. Okay, so I'll let you on a little secret. I don't think this is gonna hurt Chris Hedges too much. I had to travel in Philadelphia. This is just before I left USA for good. I traveled from Philadelphia to New York City for this interview at the studio for Russia Today, and because it was before noon or something. I was still it takes like an hour on a train or something to go from Philadelphia to New York, so I wasn't too comfortable because traveling and going there and having to find a place. So I hit a bar, to have a few Guinnesses just to relax. And then when I went to the studio, I was surprised to find how short Chris Hedges was. So they were, because in my mind he's like this, imposing dude. He's shorter than me. I'm like, wow, this is funny as shit. So anyway, so we hit it off. He's a very down to earth guy. He's no kind of pretension, no kind of whatever, arrogance or whatever. But the funniest thing was before we went on, he said, "Do not talk about 9/11." And I did not have any intention of doing that. I had no intention of doing that. I said, "Okay, don't worry, Chris. We're not going to talk about that." So I'm only bringing this up because I hope that's not any kind of an indictment, but because having been booted from the New York Times, having been pretty much canceled, Chris Hedges only had a tiny audience, residual audience of his fans, right? I mean, actually, it's not too tiny because he's still a major figure. Even now, he's a major figure. But anyway, he could not risk alienating them any further by going on about 9/11. But I wasn't going to go there, man. So what I'm trying to get at is he knows more than he's letting on. Okay, and I'm not charging him anything, but he can't afford to lose more listeners and more readers. Okay, and here's another Chris Hedges anecdote. He was invited by some student group to UPenn, University of Pennsylvania. Okay, and some Jewish groups opposed when they heard, because all these groups operate independently. They have a small budget. When I was at UPenn, I had a tiny budget. I taught for one semester. I brought some guy in. I didn't have to clear it with anybody. Didn't have to clear with the department. I just okay, come in, So anyway, all these groups have their own budgets. So they brought in Chris Hedges. But somebody found out that he was coming to UPenn, and the Jews hated him, all right? So they made a big stink about it. And the university forced the student group to cancel his invitation, all right? So that's how petty they are. Okay, I mean, that's how petty they are, and they vengeful. So what I'm trying to get is that Chris Hedges know for sure the Jewish factor in American cultural life. Okay, what they will do to you once they have any beef against you. But I think the thing he said about them, he compared Israel to like ISIS or something, like whatever. He said something a little, maybe one statement that was annoying enough that they have gone after him ever since. So what I'm trying to get is that many American intellectuals know as much as I do about Jewish power. They just don't dare to talk about it. Okay, and that's the downfall. That's the cowardice. Okay, so in the United States, most intellectuals, so-called intellectuals, are professors because that's the surest source of income. They're not journalists; they're professors. And to be a professor, you have to. But nowadays, it used to be you might get a master's degree, you can start teaching. Now you need a PhD. So you have spent all your life being groomed, to fit into this very very harsh system. Okay, and to get a PhD, you're already a full adult by the time you get out of college. So you didn't have any independence. You went from childhood through different colleges. So now you're out in the cold and you need a job, and you're just begging for somebody to hire you because there's so many PhDs out there. Okay, so you are desperate, and once you get hired, you got to get on a tenure track. So basically, it teaches you obedience. obedience to the system. So you don't dare to say anything out of line. Okay, so what I'm trying to get is that many academics, many intellectuals in the United States, I wouldn't say many, because they self-censorship, their subservience have been so ingrained that they may not even realize they are hypocrites and they are lying to themselves. But I suspect at least maybe 5% at least know that they full of it. They full of shit, but they have no choice because they have paid for their mortgage. They are married. They cannot afford to lose their job, man. So they know what to say and not what to say. And that's the downfall of the United States and across the West, man, because people self-censor themselves. What? Spent a couple months in Lebanon. In Lebanon, people don't have to worry. They talk about the Jews. They can say Jews. They're not afraid of Jews, man. Okay, I spent time in Egypt, Lebanon, and recently Jordan. So all these countries around Israel. And of course they talk about the Jews. Because if you can talk about the Russians and the Vietnamese and the Chinese, why not say Jews? Don't say Zionists, because this problem, let us put it that way, existed before Zionism. Okay, and let me be clear here. I have nothing against anyone born biologically Jewish. Zero. I have zero. Okay, I only have problem with Jewish thinking, Jewish ideology, and I think I learned a lot from from Yahweh to Zionism. That book really opened up my eyes. But I was moving towards that anyway. But that book really clarified a lot for me. So anyway, I had problem with the Old Testament and Jewish thinking, Jewish mindset, and the genocidal God that they worship. Okay, I don't have anything against anyone happen to be born Jewish. My best friend in Vumtau is a Jew. Who cares? I do not care. Most of my good friends in Philadelphia were Jews. I still consider them friends. They probably don't want to have to do with me anymore. But it's not about blood. It's about thinking. Okay. So, for example, let me cite one example. Nasser of Egypt. Okay. He became like a model for post-colonial leader. All right, because like a strong man, right? So, although he attacked Jews and Israel, he thought like a Jew, man. He thought like a Jew. Because he's a classic Marxist. Okay, so anyway, his policies basically destroy Egypt. Okay, this is a kind of a tangent, but let me just encapsulate really what he did wrong. Okay, he subsidized bread. Okay, so he fixed the price for bread. So that's a socialist policy because he thought, well, people should have bread. Okay, I mean, it sounds good. And he had rent control. That's another, he said, well, people should have access to basic housing. That's another socialist policy, So that's basically Marxism there. And then he kicked out the Jews. And he should not have kicked out the Jews and the rich people. He didn't really kick them out, but he pretty much took some of their savings away. Like people had money in the bank. Let's say you have 10 million. Say, well, now you only have one. Okay, 9 millions go to the state. Something like that. Basically, he chased them out. So he kicked out the Jews. He chased out the rich people, and he made he imposed policies that basically cripple Egypt, because rent control, basically nothing for bread, and also if you had a college degree, the government will hire you. Also, employment, right? He guaranteed employment, cheap bread, and cheap housing. So that destroyed Egypt, okay? Because landlords can no longer charge people for market price. So, Cairo is a disaster. It has fallen apart because people can't afford to fix their buildings because the rent is too cheap, okay? And the population exploded because you didn't have to worry about having children because this bread is almost nothing, okay? And if you get a college degree, you get hired by the government. So the bureaucracy became bloated. He did everything wrong, man. And that's because he got caught in this Jewish thinking. But of course, he didn't think of it as Jewish thinking. He thought he was being a good Marxist, So anyway, what I'm against is that kind of mindset. Okay, so if a Vietnamese think like that, I'm against him. I'm not against biological Jews. I'm against the Jewish mindset. Okay, of designating a whole groups would be evil. Okay, like the petty bourgeoisie, landowners, or even rich people. Rich people are not necessarily evil. Some of them are. Maybe a beggar could be evil, right? I mean, that's a Christian mindset, right? Anyone could be evil, right? It's up to the individual, right? But the Marxist mindset is that, well, group guilt, they think like that. We are the chosen, you're not the chosen, and your enemy should be destroyed totally. So they have a genocidal mindset. So you see this play out. If you look at communism, it was classic group punishment. Group demonization. So that's what I'm against. And the Vietnamese are not like that. The Vietnamese are not ideologically rigid. Vietnamese are so sloppy as far as they thinking. They worship idols that they have very vague ideas about. These are Chinese pagan idols or whatever. They worship things they can't explain. They're not very rigid thinkers. Okay, which is fine. I mean, I don't think that's great either. But hey, it has worked for them, or it works for them now. I mean, in my building, my landlord, he has this altar that has all kinds of that has like a frog with like a coin in his mouth. He probably doesn't even know what it means, man. So the Vietnamese have all kinds of objects that they pick up. Vietnamese, they have the Japanese cat with the waving arm to bring customers in. If you ask them, why do you have that? They don't know. They have all kinds of magical statues and symbols and things that they just adopt. So they're not. What I'm trying to get is that they're not Marxists. They're not communists. They can't think that rigidly. They're not ideologically coherent. Okay, but which is fine because that's who they are. I don't like to think like that. But I'm not gonna tell people how to think. So, but communists are very they want to impose one system on everybody. Okay, but the Vietnamese communists are no longer doing that because they realize it's hopeless here, and it would discredit them.
Well, from the European New Right perspective or dissident right perspective, I participated a long time in a dissident right. Vietnam is actually a place that is secretly envied by many, even white nationalists, because it is, first of all, nationalistic. You just pointed out the degree to which the official communist system is, in fact, just nationalist. The second reason why Vietnam is admired is because it has the high IQ population, although you are probably having your own thoughts about that. But that's a very important way of thinking in the historical and biological determinist school of the dissident right. And the third thing, what of course Vietnam is admired for, is that they kicked out the Americans. So we thank you for having brought some corrections to the view that we have, the idealized view of Vietnam. But in any case, just to wrap up our podcast, I'd like to ask you something more about this little speech you gave us about the Jewish revolutionary spirit. I mean, from a religious point of view, we can say it is what E. Michael Jones called the Jewish revolutionary spirit that you object to, that you see as a pernicious influence in many respects, ideological, in so-called superstructure, as Marxists would call it. And I like to ask you something about the trajectory. What do you see happening? Of course, we have now seen the Great Reset. We have seen the COVID epoch. We have seen the vaccination. Now we are seeing different things. We are seeing phenomena also inside the West and probably around the world as well, which I have called Israelization. That means techno-totalitarian system. Zionization, which is, of course, the superstructure that belongs to techno-totalitarianism, which I would call militant Judeo-latry, so the admiration of Jews, but then cultically impressed. And I think the third one would be Ukrainization. Ukrainization meaning that all nations that are not conformist to the ideal of the ruling elite are degraded in the way of Ukraine. They become a lot of pirate, prostitute states. And I think this model is being used for many countries. But there is another term I like to put to you as something that I want your opinion about. Do you think there is such a thing as accelerated Judaization. This has been a buzzword the last couple of weeks around the internet. So the accelerationist Judaization. What do you see happening on a global scale? I mean, you're very well informed. You've traveled a lot, you have read a lot, and you're informed by your sources, by many people that you know. What do you think is the trajectory we are on? Do you think there is such a thing as a accelerated, accelerationist Judaization taking place, being steered by the Trump administration and other forces? How do you see that?
Okay. When I was in Germany, there were refugees coming in, and so there were signs everywhere: "Refugees welcome." Okay, and I would tell my students at the University of Leipzig that instead of welcoming refugees, you should stop creating them. Okay, because Germany was complicit in causing chaos in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, but not all the refugees are from these countries, and also Libya. Okay, so I say, well, stop making refugees. You don't have to welcome them. Okay, but they didn't want to hear that. Because they were good Germans or good liberal Germans, so they welcomed refugees. So demographically, I thought, well, this is a disaster. I don't know if I said it quite so bluntly, but I remember you saying something about all Germans need like two Germans to recreate a new German cultures, right? Well, I think somebody else said 40,000 is like the minimum number. You say no, we only need two, but recently when between the war between Israel and Iran, many Afghan refugees in Iran were actually used by the Jews to target buildings inside Tehran. Okay, so these refugees, I don't know how many were bought by the Jews, but after the war was over, Iran kicked out practically all Afghans. So that's unfair to the rest, because only a tiny percentage of them actually were traitors to their host country. Okay, but Iran say enough; they kick them all out. Okay, so right now there's a war, a mini war. Maybe it's over already. We don't know. Day to day, everything changes. But between Cambodia and Thailand, okay, so there's 500,000 Cambodians in Thailand as workers mostly. Some of them are there to study, and there's another 1 million Cambodians in Thailand who are ethnic Cambodians. So they are Thai citizen. So there's like 1.5 million Cambodians in Thailand, which is not that. Still is a substantial number, but already there are incidents of Cambodians in Thailand being assaulted, and they're not guilty. But you always have people who go berserk, and they're gonna see a Cambodian, gonna start harassing them and start hitting them. So Cambodians are trying to get back to Cambodia, but the borders are closed. But what I'm trying to get at is when you have so many aliens in your society, you won't be able to kick them out. Especially with intermarriage. And I'm not against intermarriage. Because people marry, you marry who you want to, whatever. But the idea that people can forget their blood affinity, their blood loyalty, and just be loyal to the state, some abstract state, is I think it's not reasonable. Okay, so I think that's a big problem with the West, because the West, most Americans have not traveled to Europe, unfortunately, or if they have traveled to Europe, they only travel very superficially. They visit some sites, and they don't see like the real Europe as it is now. But also, the people who are very concerned about immigration, they only read the news. They might get like a more hysterical view of what's happening. They think every Arab is like a rapist and knifing someone on the street. So, but although it's not like that, okay, most people do try to fit in and do try to just be honest and work. They are alien, man. Because let's say in Germany, right? Now what do you feed the school kids, right? You can't feed them pork, right? Because there's so many Muslim kids, right? Just something simple as that. So once the society is so mixed up, and I think this is done very deliberately, the Jews destroy Muslim countries and then, insist white countries to take these Muslim refugees. So they're quite open about this policy. So it does not look great for the West. Maybe in the East, maybe in the Eastern Europe, the countries that are less attractive to immigrants might have a better chance of survival, paradoxically. I don't know, maybe Belarus or Moldova might have a better chance of survival than France itself, because Vietnam is still intact demographically after all the colonialism. Okay, and the Philippines is another great example. The Philippines was colonized by Spain and the United States for almost 400 years, but they're still Filipinos. Okay, the name, the country's name is already absurd. They name after a Spanish king, right? But they're still intact, socially intact. Okay, they lost their names, they lost their religions, but so what? Blood-wise, they're still the same people. So they in a sense they're more stable. The Philippines is maybe more stable than Spain, which is something bizarre to say. Now, I wish Europe the best, because every European country I visit, I think it's fun. I'm so enamored of Europe, okay? And I visit just about, maybe 20 European countries at least. I can't remember. But anyway, I was all over, and it has such a tremendous heritage. After all that destruction, the two world wars, and the communists also destroyed a lot of European heritage. And I think, that is also very tragic. And Europe had just suffered so much, but right now, the demographic situation is not something, I'm not sure it can overcome that. I hope I'm wrong, because but what do you do? I'm not for like mass deportation, because if people have lived there and if they consider themselves good citizens and they have not committed any crime, you do not have a pretext to send them. Where do you send them to? I don't know. What is your opinion on that? How do you maintain any kind of a social cohesion? How do you regain it at this point for Europe?
Well, of course, I'm coming from a traditionalist point of view, which states that the biggest protective form on earth, politically speaking, is the imperium, the empire. The empire is always rooted in one nation, but it can extend its umbrella over many nations. And like, for example, the Austrian Empire or the Russian Empire before, people can live in harmony provided that there is a protecting force, somebody and some institutions that dedicate themselves to a greater good than that of just one nation. But that doesn't mean that there will be no frictions. It just means that there is a controlling mechanism. It's like a father controls his household. A grandfather wisely decides how the rooms are divided and who is doing what and what are the task divisions. But of course, this is a very idealistic and old-fashioned point of view, and it is not conform to the modern world. I do believe that there is a program from the hostile elite to destroy all traditional forms, including, most of all, multinational empires. Multinational empires are the natural enemy of any kind of modernist regime. So minorities will be exploited. Even in my own small country, the Netherlands, we've experienced this. The Netherlands is a conglomerate of small areas, a small region at the sea, but it has been divided into 3 countries, no less. That very small area has already been divided into 3 countries. And I think British capital and geopolitical interest here have overridden the natural affinity between these United 17 provinces that one time existed. So that's true for many nations, like Ukraine has also been divided into many small, Russia has been divided in many small parts, including the Ukraine. It's very artificial. But there must be a guiding force. If there is no guiding force, of course, there is no unity, there is no harmony, and there is no ability for people to live together. So that would be the traditionalist point of view. That doesn't mean that's a realistic recipe for right now, but it does address the problem. It explains what we are facing in Europe. And of course, what the globalists doing in Europe is the opposite. They are seeing this problem, they know the remedy, and they are opposing the opposite. They are proposing a transnational, not an imperial, a transnational government system. So the EU, for example, that we have here, And I think it's very logical because from their point of view, this is the best way to implement a globalist agenda. And I do think the EU is now a more threatening force in Europe than any other, including even NATO, because it actually goes against the roots. I mean, you can damage a house, but as long as the fundaments are solid and the walls are still standing, you can repair it. But I think the EU is meant to actually undermine the fundaments of European identity, and they're quite successful in it. So, as you said, it is a big question whether Europe can survive. And that probably does not depend on any kind of political project that anybody might set up. It depends on larger equations that are very difficult to fathom. In any case, I'd like to ask you another question to conclude. We know that you don't subscribe to communism. We know that you are somebody that appreciates a natural hierarchy and meritocracy above all, and that you do not subscribe to any kind of leveling project as well culturally. That being said, you have been temporarily at points in your life been reduced to apostolic poverty, voluntarily or not. You have chosen to travel around the world rather than to stay in the heart of the West. How can people support you on your journey? Because you have been deplatformed so much and from so many spaces. Even I found it hard to find out how people can support you. Can you please say something about that?
Just subscribe to my Substack. I write quite a bit because a typical week I might write four articles, 5 articles. My subjects, although I write, basically, I mean, it might appear like travel writing, but it's a lot of social commentary and political commentaries. And I every now and then I also, I'm not an academic, but sometimes I also discuss books and writers. And you mentioned Céline. It's funny because he was a huge influence when I was a young man. I remember first reading him, I read his 2 big novels, like 900 pages, and I was like 2 pages in, I'm saying, wait a second, this is very dangerous. I really felt that because I say, wait a second, there's something very, this can really mess you up. I was about 19 or something, 20, and I was living in I was paying $25 rent in a very bad part of town in Philadelphia. So, I made a decision that I'm going to live as minimally as possible so I can have as much time as possible to do what I want. And that's when I encountered Céline. And the fact that he was a doctor in the slum, and just his life was interesting. And also he got in trouble with the Jews, and back then I wasn't even thinking about Jews, man. It wasn't a factor, but looking back, I thought, wow, he paid for everything, and you mentioned Ezra Pound, but Ezra Pound had a more privileged life, but Céline had a pretty rough life, and he was a soldier. So anyway, that immersion in day-to-day life is a good model, is a good example. I think for everybody. I mean, especially now because everything is pushing people towards evasion, avoidance of actual skin-to-skin contact, and of just breathing the air. I mean, talk about COVID. Covering your face. It's just bizarre. I mean, people just they want to avoid everything, including oxygen, which is preposterous. So, but something else about isolation. I want to throw this in because I spent 6 months in Albania, and Albania was the most isolated communist country in Europe. It really suffered. But paradoxically, when they got out of it, they were intact. They were intact. I mean, and because it's such an unattractive country for visitors, which I think is wrong. I think Albania is a beautiful country and fascinating country. I travel up and down. It's a small country, so I was all over the damn place. But they are very socially intact. A lot of, they stay themselves, more themselves than Italy, which is right across the way. more than Serbia or even North Macedonia. I mean, so anyway, so yeah, that's another paradox, that a country that suffers so much may have a better future than the richer neighbors. And Albania is also nominally a Muslim country, which is another almost a joke, because they're not really very good Muslims, man. The guys, the old men drink alcohol in the morning, so they're not very good Muslim. And the women, most of them don't cover their hair. I mean, I don't know what makes them Muslim. Nothing they do is really Muslim. So, but they're still Albanians. Okay, so how do each of us return to that state, of just being ourselves and not be contaminated any further, because we are so contaminated, so polluted, and so degraded, and this must stop and be reversed. But it's funny, I think you talk about being Christian, right? You trace the recovery of Europeans to regaining their Christianity, a more authentic Christianity. Is that correct?
Well, that's very difficult to tell if that's still possible. But traditionalist thinking, of course, teaches that people should their salvation lies in their identity. This means recovering your own roots. And of course, in Europe, traditional Catholicism, traditional Orthodoxy would be one of the mechanisms to retrieve your identity. I mean, it's partially successful in Russia, for example. There's still countries that are intact, like Greece, more or less. But this is a very difficult issue, because you have the danger of being artificial. It's like at the end of the Roman Empire. Like some emperors, they try to promote paganism, like Julian the Apostate. At the last period of the empire, he tried to do that, but it was counterproductive, because the pendulum swung in the other way after he died. So I think that's a very difficult thing. To restore something artificially is not something that you can do. It has to come from people's heart, right? The tradition is in your heart, and it is the value that you carry in yourself, probably even on an unconscious level or an archetypal awareness. And I think this is very difficult to put in a rational form. I think the experience is more important, and the authentic life is more important than any kind of state-imposed, politically imposed, or religiously imposed remedy. That brings me to something you just said. You said, in fact, what it boils down to is the authenticity, right? You said Albania is very authentically Albanian. I would agree with that. I've been in Kosovo, which is also Albanian, and it was also like that. And that brings me to something that is actually also relevant to the Homo Aeroporticus theme. Julius Evola, the great traditionalist thinker, he said, in a time where everybody travels and everybody visits the holy places and everybody is desecrating the holy shrines, in that time, the only way for an authentic person to experiment and to experience and to respect and to pay homage to the holy places is not to go there, not to travel. So I've been faithful to that. I've tried not to visit any kind of places in Europe that are so-called touristic. But by a coincidence, I have lived in the most authentic places as well. So I will not mention the name, because otherwise some people might visit it, which I don't want. I ended up in Greece that is totally unattractive, totally untouristic. Nobody wants to go there. But if you live there, you actually live between the people. You see fishermen, you see workers. You can speak Greek if you like to learn that language. You can go to the church, and there's nothing artificial about it. It's as real as it gets. And but this is off the beaten track and away from the old shrines, and especially from the shrines that are touristic. I suspect yourself, you're also living in a secondary town, as you said. I guess probably it's wise for you not to betray the name for our public in order that it is not spoiled. But in any case, I would subscribe to your idea. There are still places that are very authentic, also in Europe. Are such places, yes.
Yeah, and mix with people. I mean, that's such a natural urge, right? And I'm surprised that anyone would want to avoid that. I'm just, I take buses. I'm just relieved to be with people. It's enjoyable to just sit on the bus. I know most people would, they avoid the bus. They want the private automobile is the preferred mode of travel, right? So because when you're on a bus, you can't control the pace. It stops when it wants to. You can't control who's sitting next to you, behind you, so you can't control anything. But I find that just very enjoyable, and I think that's a natural human need. Okay, to be among people. And I go to cafes where where people are forced to sit close together because they small, they cheap, they don't have the separation. So I mean, so how to regain ourselves is just to reject living through the media, living. Of course, we must. We're talking online now, so I'm aware that the contradiction of that, but I don't walk around with a working phone. I haven't had a SIM card. Even in Jordan, I had no SIM card. So in a foreign country, you don't have a Google Maps, you're gonna get lost. But so what? I used my sense of direction to get back to where I needed to go. And if I get lost, it's fine. But that's how you see the place, more clearly. So anyway, what I'm trying to get is that just try to reject the seduction of having a virtual life, okay, which is all pervasive now. And that's how you regain yourself, and you regain your nation and regain your community. Most people don't want a community, man. They really don't want a community. So everything is steering us away from being grounded, from being among other people, just from seeing each other eye to eye. So, I think there has to be a conscious effort to reject that. That's how you regain your sanity,
On these wise words, we'll end the podcast. I'm almost tempted not to ask people not to subscribe to your Substack and not to support you, to keep you in apostolic poverty so that you can write your beautiful poetry and your beautiful other texts as well. But I will not do that. I will advise people to go to your Substack, subscribe there, help Mr. Linh Dinh, and also to look at his photo blog. This is very beautiful. We haven't touched upon that, maybe another time. It's a very interesting place to go to for its own sake. So try to subscribe, try to assist, and read this man's work, because you will find Whitman level poetry and Pound level prosa on his websites. That all being said,
Alex, I want to say.
Sorry,
Alex, I want to say one more thing. It's interesting that you mentioned Whitman, because I consider him like America's maybe first and last poet. After him, there's no more American poetry. But anyway, it's interesting. The guy wrote about China, about India, about everywhere, yes, but he didn't really go anywhere because he couldn't afford to. He unlike Mark Twain or something. Mark Twain went to Australia, man. He went, he went across the Pacific. He was in North Africa. The guy was all over the damn place. But Whitman wasn't like that. He had no money. He went as far north as Toronto and as far south as New Orleans. But he pretty much was in the New York area, and he was in Philadelphia, Camden. So anyway, but he wrote about everywhere. You know why? Because of the fucking camera. Because the photography was it was the time of the discovery of the photographs. So he was inspired by the photographs. Okay, so and I walk around with my camera, but the photograph was the beginning of the downfall, because people couldn't imagine themselves being everywhere and seeing everything when they're not seeing anything. Okay, so Whitman was. Basically, he wasn't just inspired by the camera; he acted like a camera. He talked about stuff in places very, indiscriminately. He just wanted to drag everything in. But that's the paradox of Whitman. He celebrates this promiscuity of looking, of seeing, that was introduced by the camera. But basically, it's the end. It's the end of being grounded. But he himself was actually very grounded. But I'm sure he wished he could have been a airport man like like we are. But he had no choice. He would take. There was no bridge between Philadelphia and Camden. He was living in Camden, so sometimes he would just take the ferry from Camden to Philadelphia, just to sit on the ferry, just to go back and forth across this short river, this narrow river. So he basically was stuck. But he wrote like if he's traveled everywhere. So that's Walt Whitman for you. And basically that's the story of modernity. He's like the first modern poet, first modern man, and a guy who thinks he's been everywhere but has not, who really is stuck in one place.
Well, thank you for teaching our audience something about their own culture, things that they cannot learn anymore in school. That's not being taught anymore. All that being said, Mr. Lin Dinh, I want to thank you. I hope you'll be back with our podcast, and I enjoyed it a lot. And thank you again, and goodbye.